Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Conversations on Groong episode. We have with us Dr. Sergey Markedonov to give us a Russian perspective on the war in Ukraine, how Moscow views the outcome of the Armenian Parliamentary Elections in June, and Pashinyan's so-called Western pivot. Dr. Markedonov, welcome back to the Groong podcast.
Thank you for your kind invitation.
It's a pleasure to have you, Dr. Markedonov. So let's begin with the war in Ukraine, which concerns everybody in the region. Some would say that the war has evolved into a prolonged war of attrition that commands the vast majority of Russia's military, financial, and diplomatic bandwidth. Allies observe frequently question why a global military superpower like Russia has not finished the job, quote unquote, or forced a rapid conventional resolution to the conflict. Meanwhile, competitors are trying to make inroads into traditional spheres of Russia's influence, such as Central Asia and the South Caucasus. And this perceived grinding status quo, I think, prevents Moscow from either fully pivoting towards a stable peace or comprehensively securing its frontiers, preparing right now for what it seems like a long-term confrontation with a Europe that is actively rearming. So why, Dr. Markedonov, why is Russia structurally unable, or at least appears to be, or politically unwilling to rapidly escalate and finalize the war in Ukraine, allowing itself to remain bogged down while Europe openly prepares for war in the 2030s?
Okay, thank you so much. This question is one of the most important for Russian, European security in general, and at the same time, it's one of the most frequently discussed. First idea, and let me make some identification issues. I am not a military expert. I'm a political analyst, and I will pay attention first and foremost to political dimension of this conflict or special military operation. It's a special Russian definition. First, the conflict or warfare is not performance. It's necessary to understand. First of all, Russia is opposed by a very strong opponent in terms of political and military equipments and so on. Some figures. In accordance with CIPRI, well-known institution in Stockholm observing the conflicts and wars all over the world, Ukraine allocates for military needs about 40% of its national GDP. Yeah, it's the highest ratio in the world. And in terms of all state expenses, it's about 63%. It's wrong, by the way. Don't forget that it's not the confrontation between the two powers, yeah, great power Russia and middle power Ukraine. Ukraine is supported by NATO. Just today, 36th summit of NATO in Ankara finished, and question of Ukraine was one of the most important. Moreover, Ukraine became something of test for Euro-Atlantic solidarity, because the whole last year, since last August, since the Anchorage summit, people discussed the problems in relationship between Europe and United States, between the two sides of Atlantic space. But the summit in Ankara demonstrates that in spite of some divergences, US and EU are united in their attitude to Russia. They considered peace in Ukraine not like compromise, not like deal, not like trade or something similar. The concept of punishment for peace is on the table. Some people, like Danish Prime Minister, openly said that peace is victory of Ukraine, no other results. As for Donald Trump, because previously his position was portrayed like change of approach from Ukraine to Russia, it's not true, by the way. We have, especially in my country, we have high level of expectations. Not me personally. I was skeptical since the first second of meeting between Putin and Trump in Anchorage. Why? The problem is not my anti-Americanism, of course. I analyze facts. Yes, United States after Anchorage summit decreased its aid to Ukraine. However, indirectly, this aid continued. Arms supplies from United States were ensured through Canada, European partners of Ukraine. They were not paid by federal budget of US, but it was produced in US, by the way. Of course, United States shared intelligence information, satellites, ensured effective attacks from Ukraine to Russia, including deeper regions of my country like Ural, Volga, not only borderlines. This is why it's not modest, it's not honest, sorry, to portray this confrontation like rivalry or warfare between one power and another power. It's much more complicated. I suppose that Ukrainian crisis is wider than special military operation because special military operation started in 2022 after 8 years of conflict. Maybe low intensity, nevertheless, it was a conflict. 15,000 people passed away between 2014 2022. That time, Ukraine ensured 7% of GDP for military and security needs. Not 40 like now, but 7%, like Israel, by the way, like Turkey, or approximately like Turkey and so on. And of course, they trained 500,000 militaries through the zone of so-called anti-terrorist operation. This is why this conflict had and now has at least three dimensions. One of them Ukrainian domestic, because Ukraine was a conglomerated country, split identity and so on. And the West, especially United States and its European allies, supported only one Ukraine, pro-Maidan, pro-Western, ignoring the rest of the country. And this is why it pushed Russia to be more active in 2014. And even after unification between Crimea and Russia, or return of Crimea to the safe haven, following the Putin phrase, Russia tried to balance, promoting Minsk Accords, by the way, which were supported by UN and other international formats. Russia did not realize the universal concept to Donbass, comparing with Crimea. Crimea was the unique case, not Donbass. Russia was ready to negotiate about particular status of Donbass, and those activities were ignored because the West, partners of Ukraine, considered Minsk Accords and negotiations like pause for strengthening of Ukrainian capabilities and so on and so on. And last not the least dimension, second one, of course, Ukrainian-Russian, and third one, Russia-NATO, Russia the West. Because for Russia, this conflict is considered to be a fight for right to be part of the European and global decision-making process. Because Russia was not and is not satisfied by NATO centrism, American hegemony in the globe, in Europe, and especially along the Russian borders. And Svet and Ovik, you are absolutely right, saying that near abroad or post-Soviet space is considered to be the zone of particular interest of Russia. It's not imperial claims. It concerns on security, economic developments, special prerogatives existed prior to active penetration of the West of this territory, including, for example, military-industrial complex. Because prior to 2014, Russia and Ukraine effectively cooperated in this area, which was very important in terms of Russian security and so on and so on. This is why this conflict is considered to be the test for Russian capability to play important role in the decision-making process.
Is it passing the test? So from what I hear, the conflict is not between Russia and Ukraine. Thereby, maybe the explanation for why it appears to be a long and protracted conflict. Did Russian policymakers miscalculate, for instance, the contribution of NATO towards this conflict?
Of course,
And
Russia.
Yeah, and also just to add, you can answer all of them at once. Maybe it's the same question. Is the current pace of the conflict a calculated choice by Russia still, or is it essentially beyond Moscow's control? And there are some bottlenecks that Russia cannot control within its own conventional military capabilities.
Of course, Russia is in the process of passing these tests. It's not finished, by the way, because the problem of many analysts they try to oversimplify observing the course of this warfare or special military operation, because it looks like swing warfare. Yeah, sometimes Russia won and was more successful. Sometimes Ukraine and so on. Again, it's not the pure conflict of two neighboring powers. We should also take into the account such variable like NATO support, diplomatic military training process, decision making, intelligence, and so on and so on. Yeah, it's I understand that Russian propagandists have become subject of jokes. No NATO in the military arena. Yes, of course, no soldiers of the United States or officers, but officers are in Ukraine training, preparing people in Ukrainian army to attack Russian objects and so on. With no satellites, with no intelligence information shared between United States and Ukraine, it's impossible to imagine attacks of Ukrainian army to Yekaterinburg, Tumen, and some other areas. It's also part of the variable. As for Russian approach and ability or disability to finish the war, it's kind of paradoxical evaluation. On the one side, Russia is portrayed like very weak country, which is not capable to finish war and so on. It's one side of the coin. But the other side, people who are leaders of Germany, France, Lithuania, especially Baltic countries, Sweden, said Russia maybe tomorrow, maybe in a year, will attack Europe. Sorry, we are weak or we are so strong to attack the whole Europe, to destroy NATO, to destroy the Euro-Atlantic solidarity. Please choose the option if there's multiple choice. Russia is a weak power which was absolutely disabled to do something, or Russia is a kind of boogeyman, yeah, who could attack Germany tomorrow, France in 2 days and 2 weeks, and Baltic countries immediately. It's necessary to understand. As for miscalculations, I can agree with Ovik that miscalculations were done because it's a well-known proverb, yet generals prepare to the war of past, yeah? And of course, many people in Russia, including the highest level of decision making, were hostages of 2014 Crimea victory, Crimea story. And many people really believe that maybe Ukraine was not so strong as it had been in 2014. But again, 4 years passed between 2014 2022. Many things changed and Ukrainian identity became more anti-Russian, and Ukraine was supported diplomatically, politically, and so on. However, this fact did not abandon some other facts that now European Union, especially in lesser extent United States, are not ready to deal with Russia, to trade with Russia, saying, okay, guys, you should do this, this, and this, but we should do this, this, and that. Because last year and for a period between last August and this July, many people discussed stubbornness of Russia and raised question, why did Russia ignore the ceasefire and so on? Because ceasefire is good in terms of humanitarian reasons. We are all human beings, and of course we should think about victims on the ground, rank and file people, civic population, and so on, so on. And of course, huge losses, expenses, cynically thinking and speaking on defense and so on. However, this ceasefire does not discover problems of future status of Ukraine. Will it join NATO immediately or in 10 years, 50 years? Because former Chancellor of Federal Republic of Germany said, okay, maybe Ukraine will be NATO member in 15 years. And what? This is not solution for Russia, because after collapse of the USSR, Russia was not accepted in the club of NATO. Russia offered to join this club and always was rejected. At the same time, NATO enlarged many times. The biggest enlargement took place in 2004. It was 10 years prior of Crimea, because the beloved argument of European Union, yes, maybe we are radical now. Maybe we are not so positive to Russia and sometimes anti-Russian, but it happens because Russia violated this, and this. Guys, it's necessary to be honest. It's my address not to you personally, but to the wider audience in the West. You enlarged NATO many times. You intervened in the Balkan countries and post-Soviet space. Please, Georgia, 5 days war in 2008, and so on. You ignored Russian reasons for indivisible security, multiple multiple security, not singular, for and with NATO auspices, and so on and so on. Crimea was a consequence, not prerequisite of this crisis, by the way. This question of status of Ukraine, its affiliation with NATO, European security is on the table. It's not resolved, by the way. And one more problem of United States is discrete approach. We should discuss Ukraine, not Transnistria, not Caucasus. Okay, we maybe let's imagine. Yeah, let me make some fantasies. Trump tomorrow will change its views and will be ready to meet with Vladimir Putin, and they will reach strategic treaty, blah, 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 and so on. Okay, on Ukraine, what's about Transnistria? In 2 days, the question of Russian peacekeepers will happen. Are the occupants there or peacekeepers? Question of Abkhazia, South Ossetia. United States are not ready to find comprehensive solutions, and especially European Union. They are dreaming only on loss of Russia on the battlefield. It's not accessible. This is where Russia is going on. As for Russian test passing right now in the process, there are many problems. Many people said, oh, Russia should ensure mobilization. But mobilization concerns every Russian family. It's risky, by the way. And Russia had experiences of 1917, for example, yeah? And we remember results of it. It's risky. Some other things. Russia can make escalations. Yes, of course. Some people, some radicals in Russia say, okay, we will attack a residential area of Zelensky, kill him, and so on and so on. Maybe. But we could also have measures from that side. It's also necessary to understand. Just recently, observe Iranian experience. Iran lost 40 highest rank officials, 40, not 1, 2. Just recently, they provided farewell ceremony with Rahbar Ali Khamenei. Even Rahbar was killed, and his son, his fate is not quite clear, by the way. This is why it's also necessary to take into the account. Russian leadership takes into the account mobilization resource, Ukrainian and Russian. Russian is bigger. It's not bad, it's not good. It's not dependent on my on color of my passport, and so on.
Professor, okay, you've mentioned a number of problems, essentially all around Russia. From a strategic standpoint, how can Moscow realistically prepare for the broader Western encirclement, as we're discussing, when the primary military forces and command structures in Russia are entirely consumed by this Ukrainian theater?
And can I just also add, we have heard voices in Russia, such as Dr. Sergey Markedonov, who say that Russia should now consider actively the use of tactical nuclear weapons because the West, rather than escalating, rather than sort of trying to achieve peace, is escalating the conflict, and that should be an option in the Russian tool set. So, is it really that the issue has come down to that, but that now like nuclear weapons are being considered.
It's so comfortable for some Western observers and politicians to show Karaganov saying, oh, please, Karaganov is advisor of Putin, and he suggests to apply nuclear arsenals and so on. It's one of viewpoints in Russia. There are some other points. Moreover, I can quote some of my colleagues, for example, Ivan Timofeyev, who is Director General of Russian International Affairs Council, one of influential think tanks, who said that this issue is rather problematic. The other viewpoint, article by Vasily Kashin, published recently in Russian Global Affairs, who criticized the Karaganov's approach, and so on and so on. It's cozy to say that Russia is a totalitarian country, no discussions. We have discussions, and Karaganov's viewpoint is not the only one. Moreover, Vladimir Putin publicly criticized Sergei Karaganov. I understand that Karaganov could be used, maybe directly, indirectly, like a special tool for the discussion with the West. Guys, we potentially have this instrument, but it does not mean that this instrument will be finally used. Maybe you know that in the time of Friedrich the Great or Louis XIV, there was a popular Latin slogan, ultima ratio regis, the last argument of kings. Yeah, it's last argument. I'm not sure that Russia is ready to apply to use nuclear arsenals immediately. Hypothetically, maybe, but not immediately. It's not the issue on the table. Russia concerns, first of all, its place, its role in global European decision making, security of its borders, and clarification of status of Ukraine, guarantees, and so on. How to prevent similar scenario in Ukraine properly and in some other conflict points. It's also necessary to understand. You can say that, yes, Russia is emphasizing Ukrainian dimension and Ukrainian theory, first of all. But in the beginning of our discussion, you rightly noted that results of special military operation will very important, maybe not decisive, but very important factor predetermine our relations with Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, all the countries of Central Asia and South Caucasus. I am not a champion of Ukra-determinism, saying that everything in Nagorno-Karabakh or Central Asia, Abkhazia, are connected with the direct influence of Ukrainian crisis. However, a lot of traces of indirect influence can be found. Of course, Azerbaijan used the Russian emphasis on Ukraine to make pressure on peacekeepers in Karabakh, of course, and to promote a critical, at least in some aspects, anti-Russian atmosphere in mass media and so on. Of course, this situation was used in favor of one side, Azerbaijan, to strengthen Azerbaijani-Turkish strategic ties and so on. It's true. And of course, some elements of historical policies. Just recently, we were witnesses of a conference in Shusha covering ethnopolitical situation, historical legacies, and so on, when Russia was blamed for so-called genocide of Circassians and ethnic discrimination and so on. Of course, the more or less successful variant for Russia will open new windows, new ways to strengthen ties with post-Soviet countries, and it will be proof that Russia is able to change situation, to deserve its right to say something, to object the US hegemony and pan-NATO security system. Because one more problem of NATO is not Ukraine only, because NATO claims to be universal organization, not only Euro-Atlantic, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. For example, Arctic or Afghanistan is not part of Euro-Atlantic world, by the way, but NATO is present everywhere, trying to diminish the role of UN, OSCE, some other international institutions, and so on. Russia is not happy. And of course, the value of this Ukrainian conflict is much higher than our predictable neighbor, predictable Ukraine. It's wider, by the way. But of course, Russia should take care on victims among the population and some economic vulnerabilities, because Ukraine can stop any things about money expenses and so on. They could wait help from Trump, from Merz, from Macron, and so on. Russia has no Macron and Trump.
Yeah. Let me be, we mentioned a lot of things that we should probably start talking about, including the South Caucasus, but I do want to ask this one last question. So it seems that given that the nuclear option is not, we just discussed, is not one of the primary tools in the tool set yet. Um, in light of that, and in light of the current issues, which it seems to be to the contrary, the situation is not going towards peace. It seems to be escalating more. What is the minimum threshold of territorial control, maybe, or some kind of political solution that Russia requires before it considers the Ukraine conflict settled? We hear Russian officials talk about Novorossiya, and for those who don't know, that means, Odessa. It means essentially Ukraine that is a rump state. Is that now, at least, can we ascertain if that is now, um, the plan? And if not, where is the plan? At what stage will Russia consider, okay, this is somewhere where we can at
Okay.
least freeze the conflict for a long time?
We said already that Russian special military operation was evolution from special to military, yeah? Because initially Russians thought about kind of replica of 2014 maybe, but then situation began changing, and of course, taking about the Russian official position, we should not quote some deputies of State Duma thinking about Odessa or Novorossiya and so on. There is a question on the table offered by Putin, Lavrov, and so on, and the liberation of the rest of Donetsk region, small, tiny territories of Donetsk region, offered to be part of the solution. Liberation of two people's republics, Lugansk and Donetsk. It's also necessary to understand that Russian position evolved. It was not primordial. In 2014, Russia considered Crimea as unique area historically in terms of memory, legacy, identity, and so on. Not Donbass. Donbass became part of territorial issue only after failure of Minsk Accords. The last round of negotiations took place on February 10, 2022, 2 weeks prior the start of special military operation. Those negotiations continued more than 9 hours, but no solution. This is why problem of territories of Donbass. Then problems of buffer zones, because Russian borders, especially Belgorod, Kursk, were attacked. And you know that part of Kursk region was captured by Ukrainian troops. And it takes some months. Russia also took care seriously on victims, on minimizing of human losses and so on. It's also necessary to take into the account, because there is a problem of conventional wisdom saying that, oh, Russia is based on Stalin's experience of World War II and so on. It's not true, by the way. This is why the territorial problem is not and was not a fix for Russia. Territorial issues were used to strengthen position for negotiations and security of neighboring areas on the Russian side, like Belgorod, Kursk, Rostov, and so on and so on. Because in the current Western narrative, there are photos and screenshots of Russian attacks on Kiev, Kharkov. It's impossible to ignore. Yeah, I am not going to do it. However, victims on the Russian sides absolutely ignored, are not taken into the consideration. Just recently, I was in Serbia, Belgrade, and had access to some European channels. No info on victims among civil population in Russia and so on. Just recently, for one of attacks of Ukrainian army on the Moscow region, one boy of 6 months, not a year, was killed. No info about it. Of course, Russia should take care about buffer zones, and territories are used to reach more or less reliable platform for negotiations. Because Ukrainian position is we should return to the borders of 1991. Okay, but in this situation, this scenario will be considered to be victory of Ukraine and loss of Russia. All the questions raised by Russia prior to special military operation negotiations will be ignored. What will it mean? In 2, 4, 5 years, maybe Russia will strengthen its position, resentment will be still alive, and what should we do? To start new special military operation in order to ensure better position of Russia. Yes, vicious circle. One of my opponent who supports totally Ukraine, Michael Kaufman, military expert of US, recently published the article in Foreign Affairs, and he raised this question, being completely disagreed with my position or position of Russian expert community. He said about political results, we should take into the account political dimension of this warfare, not only military. Because if the sides will find political solution, for example, decreasing of Ukrainian territory and status of neutral power, maybe kind of Finlandization, okay. All those things could be excluded in 2013, in 2010, for example. Even make an interview in 2008, 2007, Vladimir Putin did not identify Crimea as a Russian territory. But ignoring of Russian reasons, interests inside Ukraine, around and about European security will ensure what we have right now. It's also necessary to understand because the problem of the Western narrative is absence of shared solidarity. Okay, we can recognize mistakes, miscalculations of Russia, maybe some ambitions, and so on and so on. Okay, good. But please recognize your own mistakes. No mistakes. I observed Ankara summit. It looked like Congress of Communists in Stalin's time, the Congress of Winners. Everything is good, democracy, stability, security, but with no Russia. Sorry, we are so big, we are too big to fail.
Yeah, you're absolutely right that it's very difficult to find. Actually, it is possible to find the Russian side of the issues in the United States, but you really have to try because they don't come up, for example, in Google searches. You cannot find them on social media. They are often censored or they come up with a whole bunch of warnings, extra clicks that you have to go through to get to those news sources because they're Russian sources. So it's not easy for people to find that information as easily, for example, the information that you can find about Ukrainian losses. So you're absolutely right.
And let me express briefly my sincere gratitude to this opportunity because with your help, we try to fix the disproportion in discussion of the special military operation or Ukrainian war, if you want, taking into account the Russian angle of observation. You can disagree with me completely, yeah? But you allowed me to express discussions in my country and to better understand the Russian reasons behind this conflict and Russian angle of observation. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you. Professor, we're going to talk about Russia's view of what's going on in Armenia, but I want to focus for a moment just on the TRIPP, the Trump route project, I should say. So it's increasingly analyzed through a cold military lens rather than just a purely commercial one. Specifically, it's viewed as a Western mechanism to project strategic logistical corridor through the South Caucasus to the Caspian, to the Central Asian plateau. Effectively, this seals Iran's northern border and it tries to contain Russia from the south. And Tehran has repeatedly drawn a very firm red line regarding the inviolability of its border with Armenia. Meanwhile, in parallel to all this, the US-Iran negotiations are seen more and more as a pause in the second war on Iran, rather than a step towards a comprehensive peace. Once again, we have a process. We don't necessarily have the peace itself. The pause affords the US and Israel to reload their militaries for the next phase of hostilities. And generally, people, analysts are expecting that after the October and November elections in Israel and the United States, there could be a flaring up, a possible third war. Now, just last week, Israel's cabinet, there was a resolution to recognize the Armenian Genocide. And after many conversations, we've realized that it is not viewed as a moral awakening. It is more of a calculated geopolitical wedge designed to provoke and coerce Turkey out of its neutrality and into an active role in the next phase of a broader anti-Iran military campaign. So, looking at TRIPP from a realist framework, which is your specialty, realist frameworks, how can a transport corridor running through Armenia ever function peacefully when it is structurally designed to act as a Western containment wall to isolate Iran and encircle Russia from a southern flank?
First point, I cannot treat TRIPP like a clear economic instrument. In my Soviet youth, there was a special university subject as a political economy. It's political economy, of course. It's not clear economic project. As for Russia, this project in perspective is not so comfortable because it will cover only 40 or 50 kilometers. It's not so long, by the way.
Right.
And I'm not sure that it will be breakthrough in terms of transportation, logistics. I am not seeing any transformation of this plot of the land to the global industrial logistical hub. Let's see and compare the situation with the railway connection Baku-Khalkhalaki-Tbilisi-Kars. A lot of rumors, a lot of discussions, but practically zero effectiveness, by the way, in terms of tons, kilograms of supplies, and so on and so on. However, these 40 kilometers will establish a lot of problems for north-south corridor, because the key to this door will be in United States hands. It's not so good for Russia and, of course, for Iran. Because for Iran, of course, Middle East is the top priority. So South Caucasus, till recent years, Iran was not so active, trying to keep off Armenian and Azerbaijani problems. But after the second and especially third Karabakh war, South Caucasus became more important for Iran because Iran considers TRIPP corridor as an instrument how to ensure isolation of this country. Russian position to the Caucasus is much more flexible than Iranian, because for us there are some nuances in policies of Israel, Turkey. We register the problems between them, problems between both of them and the United States and their strategic alliances and so on. For Iran, there is a triangle of challenges: Israel, United States plus UK, and Turkey. No differentiation. Maybe there are some reasonabilities in this approach, I suppose. However, Russia, especially when TRIPP was initially proclaimed, demonstrated its readiness to cooperate with the United States. And this dispute is not over. Some officials, not only journalists or experts, but even some officials said, yes, Russia can join this project, having particular interest in Armenia, no necessity to give monopoly of transportation logistics to United States. As for Iran, only one response: no. In this way, we can share our positions. Many things will be dependent on American behavior in the Ukrainian crisis, of course, because now we see the escalation from American side. It doesn't mean that last year Trump became pro-Russian. No, of course. He was less radical. Now he became more radical. Of course, the consequences of escalation in Iran, because a week ago we discussed the finish of Iranian-American escalation. Maybe we discussed some options for peace deal between Tehran and Washington. No, frankly speaking, I was skeptical again to this because it's one of the most beloved methods of Trump, combining some methods of punishment for peace, pressure, and openness for dialogue. This
Right.
method, realistic, by the way, you said about realistic perspective. Trump demonstrates its realistic perspective. He is very far from values like previous administration. Of course, we can say it was a manifestation of hypocrisy and it was not honest position. Yes, of course. Nevertheless, values were part of the set of American approach. Now, no, only cynicism, sometimes looking like social Darwinism, maybe. But we have what we have, of course.
Dr. Markedonov, if I can just ask a follow-up. You mentioned that Russian position with regard to the South Caucasus and TRIPP especially is more nuanced than Iran's, which it seems to be right now a very thick red lines in terms of what the U.S. can do. I mean, at least before the war, and it appears to have continued. But does Russia have any red lines when it concerns TRIPP at all? We've seen Russian policymakers and Russian analysts talk about being re-engaged or being somehow engaged in TRIPP, and now talking about November 9/10. We've heard them talk about the Treaty of Turkmenchai, but is that a like nice to have desire, or is that a red line? What is Russia's red line with regard to TRIPP?
Okay. First of all, one clarification. Russian position is nuanced in some aspects because Russia is so skeptical in perspectives of realization of TRIPP. And many experts like Stanislav Tkachenko or some other economists, Stanislav Tkachenko published recently a special report concerning the transportation in the South Caucasus. And he concluded that no real options for TRIPP implementation. Let's see. I'm discussing TRIPP project not like witness outside of the region or witness sitting in the cabinet thinking, dreaming about some utopian ideas. I was in Sunik. I walked around those places. And in many parts of this potential route, no railway connection. Some parts of this connection is replaced by auto connection. It's necessary to have a couple of years to evaluate the potential of this road using some methods of geography and, of course, economic matters should be taken into the account. This is why Russian position is much more nuanced in this situation. Of course, Russia understands also its role in Armenia. We will cover this problem a little bit later, but economic presence of Russia is incomparable with Iranian one. And of course, for Russia, Caucasus has been and has been priority for a long time. For Iran, no. This is why Iran looks at the South Caucasus like new potential area of hostilities and encirclement of the country also. This is why it helps us to explain the divergences between Russia and Iran. As for red lines, if United States will push Russia to leave the region, or, for example, United States will do something to organize peace treaty signing between Azerbaijan and Armenia. United States claims to replace Russia as key moderator, and it's supported by European Union. But at the same time, for US, this area is not top priority. It's also necessary to take into the account. And for them, a peace treaty is not a problem of problem number one. to do it immediately or tomorrow. This is why it can be used to reconfigure the Russian presence in the region. I suppose that strengthening of security presence of United States in the region will be treated like red lines. And one more point. Russia, unlike Iran, has an opportunity to observe the Iranian-American conflict not like engaged country. It's our prerogative, yeah? Maybe cynically speaking or realistically speaking, profit, yeah, to observe the rivalry between two powers, and we should take into the account results of this rivalry, first and foremost to formulate red lines.
Okay. Professor, you mentioned the railway situation in Sunik that you have witnessed. The railway concession, of course, is in the hands of Russia until I think something like 2038. Now, Pashinyan accuses Russia of not investing properly in this concession and not maintaining the railways properly, and wants to take over those concessions. And there's, of course, conflict between Armenian viewpoint and the Russian viewpoint. I'm not entirely sure what the conflict is, but I feel from what we understand is that Turkey and Azerbaijan have told Pashinyan that they don't want to use the systems unless they are not under Russian control. So essentially, it's a little bit of a coercion to kick Russia out of Armenia. And one more aspect of this is that Mikhail Galuzin has recently said that Russia must be involved in the TRIPP project, or they want to have a role in it. What is the role that Russia wants in all this?
First of all, railway connection in Armenia is variable only in the wider context, not properly. Properly, this plot of the land is not valuable, and Pashinyan understands this, should understand at least. As for Russian investment, Russia invested in this plot of the land as this railway connection, but understanding that it's not profitable enterprise, by the way, it's not a beneficiary. It's also necessary to understand. And having infrastructure problem inside the country, we at the same time found money, allocated them, ensuring more than 5,000 jobs in Southern Railway Company. It's also necessary to take into the account. Of course, Russia is not benevolent organization. It's understandable. And Russia is interested to minimize geopolitical risk, offering through Galuzin and some other persons to be involved in a TRIPP project. If this project, as Trump said, is not against Russia, it's not about replacement of one mediator by another one, okay? We are ready. We should use any chances. Because again, Russia is blamed for absence of productive approach, radicalism and so on. But Russia demonstrated many times readiness to cooperate with outsiders, even in the territory of the post-Soviet space. Yeah, we treat this territory as a zone of priority interest, yes. But let me remind you that Vladimir Putin, when Russians had Gabala radar, offered the United States to cooperate, even deterring Iran. Okay, guys, if Iran is headache for you, please. This idea was not accepted. Now we offered to be engaged in TRIPP project. But it seems to me Americans are eager to be the only candidate, the only actor in the region. It's not so good for Russia, by the way. And let's see, because United States wasted a lot of words demonstrating its reliability for Armenians, but no security guarantees, no real effective mediating between Azerbaijan and Armenia, and no serious economic investments. It's also necessary to understand. Coming back to your question on Israeli initiative of the government of this country, I don't see here any moral stances. Of course, cabinet took into the account position of expert human rights community of Israel, because those guys discussed this question long time prior to the initiative of Minister of Foreign Affairs of Israel. And they demanded to recognize the genocide of Armenians. But only now Netanyahu and cabinet decided to recognize the genocide of Armenians. And there is a paradoxical situation. Armenian government ignored this decision, saying that this is not a topical issue, and Pashinyan rejected the idea of international support of
He called it
idea of
weaponization.
yeah, yeah. Because he prefers to build real Armenia. Frankly speaking, I don't know how it's possible to build a future with ignoring of the past. The Bolsheviks did it, and the guys, leaders of French Revolution. But in both cases, they
It
failed.
didn't end so well, yeah.
Yeah, they had to restore some elements of ancien regime. Yeah, in the first case, or the Imperial Russia in the second one, and so on so on. This is why I don't believe in it. And speaking about this initiative of government, let me finalize. I'm not sure that it will change geopolitical status quo in both Middle East and South Caucasus. As for Azerbaijan, yeah, Azerbaijan demonstrated its dissatisfaction. However, it will not be obstacle for deepening military cooperation between Tel Aviv and Baku. I'm not sure. As for Turkey and Israel, at least for last 15, 20 years, we witnessed a lot of crisis in relations between Tel Aviv and Ankara. In many cases, United States helped to reconcile and so on. I suppose United States will do a lot to reconcile in
Yeah.
order to ensure peace in this family of allies.
I concur with your opinion here because I read that Israel actually coordinated its recognition or attempt at recognition with Baku, but nobody in Armenia.
Yeah. To me, it's not. They're not friends. They're not enemies. They're frenemies, and they're not just frenemies. They're best frenemies. So anyway, let's move to the results of the June election in Armenia. To the outside observer, and maybe we're wrong, so we'd love to know your point of view as well. The aftermath of the June elections seems to us that Pashinyan's political leadership continues to signal a definitive strategic pivot towards the West. Ursula von der Leyen was just in Armenia promising all kinds of support for Armenia in exchange or in order to supplant losses from the Russian market if Armenia has any. And that includes tariff, free access, infrastructure grants, lines of credit, and so forth. The election has also re-engineered the Armenian political landscape. I mean, Pashinyan still maintains a majority in Armenia, but the number two power now in the opposition is Samet Karapetyan's strong Armenia, which became the primary opposition force. And that is also viewed as a change from the Robert Kocharian-led opposition, in that, Robert Kocharian was more associated with the war in Karabakh, and he had many people on the team that were also associated with the war in Karabakh. And Samet Karapetyan is more known as a businessman, as a why not oligarch, and more as a pragmatic person. So, what is your view? What is the view from Moscow on the outcome of these elections and about the possibility of Russia to work with both the government of Armenia and also the opposition in Armenia?
Let me briefly react on your quote on Ursula von der Leyen's help. He promised a package of 52 million euros. Yeah, I talked recently with my good friend who is entrepreneur in Armenia. He covers the sales of flowers. He said this help will cover 2-3 days of his work. Good, yeah, 2-3 days of one entrepreneur. It's kind of personal concern for Armenian businessmen. Okay, but let me keep off jokes and turn to serious discussion and analysis. First result of parliamentary elections in Armenia. They demonstrated that Armenian community, Armenian society is split half-half, because a little bit less than 50% of all votes were for ruling party, civic treaty. At the same time, it doesn't mean that 50% of the whole population voted for it, because only 1,476,000 people voted. It's a little bit more than about 60%, but nevertheless, yeah, it demonstrates that Armenian community, Armenian society is not something primordial singular. Yeah, it's split. And as for party results, they are rather controversial, because you're right. The ruling party got an opportunity to form a cabinet with no coalitions. It's good. However, they lost some very important seats. 72 in previous parliament, 64 in this one, and it's not guaranteeing the constitutional majority. But the key issue of Armenian, not only domestic but foreign policy life, is question of referenda on constitution, because Azerbaijan insists on constitutional amendments, excluding their declaration of sovereignty adopted in August 1990. It's crucial prerequisite for peace treaty signing. And the idea of referenda is not so popular. And it helps us to explain why Pashinyan did not identify referenda with electoral process, parliamentary process. As for strong Armenia, interesting option, because this party has not existed even for 1 year. Samuel Karapetyan was no name prior to last year. No name. He was a well-known entrepreneur with a Russian passport and so on. But in Armenian political life, he had not played any role. But for period for less than 1 year, he established organization. It reflects the request.
Can I mention one thing, Professor? Samvel Garabedian was well known for philanthropic reasons, and also the businesses that he had in Armenia.
Yes.
So the name was definitely well known, although, like you said, in politics, he was not a
Let
presence.
me clarify. Yes, it was well known, but by whom? Maybe teachers of universities, businessmen, politicians, not to rank and file Uncle Ashot in Vanadzor or Artashat. I'm not sure that they took care about Samuel Karapetyan.
Not a political presence.
Yeah. And in political life, he was absent. And it reflects the request of the society for the third way, third version, political project, third power, by the way, because legitimacy of Pashinyan since the first day of Velvet Revolution was ensured by the rivalry between real Armenia, new Armenia, current Armenia, and past. So-called people belonging to the party of war and so on. But nowadays, those notions are not looking like fresh, because new Armenia, sorry, but Pashinyan is in power after 2018 May, not 1 year, not 2 years. Yeah, Levon Ter-Petrosyan was a president for a little bit more than 7 years. As for Sargsyan and Kacharyan, 10 years. But Pashinyan, 8 years, and he got support for more 5 years. Totally, hypothetically, he will be in power for 13 years. More than Sargsyan, Kacharyan, Ter-Petrosyan. New impressive record, by the way. What's about novelties? What's about new dimension of political life? This is why we see the transformation of revolution process and revolution legitimacy to the prolongation project. It's interesting transformation, because even now, Pashinyan exploits the revolutionary rhetoric, saying new stage of revolution, new type of revolution, saying that all the people who voted for opposition did it for bribes and the hypocritical and so on and so on. He announced new wave of cleansing of political space in Armenia, or maybe sanation. This sanation started with parliament, then government, then judicial branch of power, then Karabakh elite in de facto state prior to Second Karabakh War and 2023 Third Karabakh War and liquidation of infrastructure of NKR and so on. Now, next point is extermination of opposition forces existing now, which are treated like pro-Russian. It's also necessary to add some nuances, because Vladimir Putin said about pro-Russian forces talking with Pashinyan, not naming exactly persons whom did he meant, but Nikol Pashinyan specified this issue, saying that it's triangle, three heads of dragon, Karapetyan, Kacharyan, and Tsarukyan. However, in the course of electoral campaign, Samuel Karapetyan allowed divorce between Armenia and CSTO organization. He said, maybe if we would find some options or reasons to go out, to leave this organization, we did it. This is why it's also a nuanced situation. Of course, both Pashinyan and Karapetyan or Kacharyan are pro-Armenian politicians, but they had and have now their specific images of Armenia. Real Armenia, or Armenia based on historical legacy, maybe traumas, maybe losses, but continuing this tradition of Armenian statehood and so on, or something revolutionary. Of course, these elections will be also known and discussed due to their geopolitization. In my viewpoint, those electoral processes were geopoliticized first time after the Armenian independence in 1991. Let's see on electoral campaign of 2021. Russia, United States, France, all of them did not compete each other. It did not compete for personality of Pashinyan, did not target this party or that party like pro-Western, pro-Russian, and so on. Pashinyan expressed his gratitude to Putin first, then to Macron and Biden in 2021. And Russia, of course, congratulated Pashinyan on his victory in 2021. Moreover, Russia did not do any serious attempts to label so-called pro-Russian troops or forces, in Armenian political arena. In 2026, we had a geopolitical dimension. Pashinyan was totally supported by the West. Moreover, violations of democracy, administrative resource, and arrests of leaders were absolutely ignored by the West. J.D. Vance attended Armenia, and this visit was accompanied by attacks, media and legal attacks on Catholicos, Gheorghin II. No objections. J.D. Vance is well known due his traditionalism, support of Christianity. Armenia is, the first Christian country in the world. Country adopted Christianity as official religion 14 years prior to Roman Empire did it. Prior to
Professor, even last week when Ursula von der Leyen was in Baku, and Armenia, she did not raise any of these issues regarding the Armenian POWs, regarding Christian monuments being heritage being erased, etc., etc. These are not their concerns, apparently. Democracy,
Moreover,
heritage, identity. All
yes,
they
when
want
she
is their.
congratulated Pashinyan on his victory of his party, she especially noted that spirit of Velvet Revolution was alive. Democracy, blah, blah, and so on.
President Putin has not congratulated Pashinyan. Is that something in the works or is not coming?
But can I also add something?
Yes,
Because
obviously.
because we're seeing now a complete persecution of the Armenian opposition, and
A criminalization,
besides,
as a matter of fact, a
yeah,
criminalization
yeah.
of the opposition.
So besides just congratulating or finding a way to work with Armenia, is Russia going to do more, or is it going to allow Pashinyan to trample all of the Armenian opposition, to senate? I think that is a word. I don't know if that's a word, but to essentially destroy the Armenian opposition, or can Russia do something to maybe through soft power to help the Armenian opposition to work with both sides? And well, how do you see this issue resolving?
Okay, as for sanation, this word goes back to the times of Józef Pilsudski in Poland. It means cleansing of political playground from opponents through criminalization, defamation, by the way, media campaigns, and push into immigration, and so on and so on. Some replicas of this practice is seen now in Armenia. As for Putin's congratulations, let me clarify. It's interesting that just on the eve of voting day, Putin congratulated Nikol Pashinyan on his birthday. After some restrictions imposed by Russia and crisis which became more or less clear for all people observing the situation in Armenia and around. However, it was also a kind of invitation for Nikol Pashinyan to think some more times about keeping relations with Putin. Let me discover our own secrets, our cuisine, yeah? But prior to our tonight talk, we discuss some vectors of Russian-Armenian relations, scenarios for crisis or maybe anti-crisis measures, and so on. And my idea was Russia is trying to keep off ultima ratio regis, last argument, yeah? Understanding the narrow space for maneuver for Nikol Pashinyan. It's not coincidence Mikhail Mishustin, Prime Minister of Russia, formally colleague of Pashinyan, formally, not de facto,
Right.
but formerly colleague of Pashinyan, talked on him via telephone. Then they met in person in Yekaterinburg for a prestigious technological forum in the capital of Ural, Yekaterinburg, one of the biggest cities in Russia. Very interesting cities, by the way, birthplace of our first president, Boris Yeltsin, and so on. And of course, it was symbolic. However, I'm not sure. I more than happy. I would like to be optimistic, but my expert conscience is an obstacle for this professional optimism. I'm rather skeptical because I suppose the visit of Pashinyan is not return to old normality. It's a search of reconfiguration of the Russian-Armenian relations. Maybe it's kind of new normality. I'm not sure that Russia will rush with recognition of results of Pashinyan and his party. I'm sure that Russian leadership and especially Vladimir Putin will analyze the situation, demonstrating Armenia arsenal of potential ways. Guys, see, restriction is one way, telephone talks and hopes to reconcile. The other option, dependence on export, import, and so on. Please, it's kind of variations. It's invitation to choose.
I have a quick follow-up on this. You mentioned the exchange of birthday wishes, and I consider that sort of an olive branch, let's talk, is what they were saying. A recognition that there's a new situation and let's talk about it. But then after the elections in the last week or so, we read enough times that Pashinyan had tried to raise Putin on the telephone, and Putin had not been picking up the phone. Uh, so somewhere along the line, we felt like Pashinyan crossed a red line. We don't know what that red line is exactly. Do you?
Um, Frankly speaking, I'm not a great fan of this concept red line because all the red lines are discussed. Uh, as an editor-in-chief now, I'm in preparing of new issue of our journal concerning the problem of borders. Very paradoxical phenomenon. On the one side, borders are proclaimed every time, every leaders like sacred, like something not disputed. But at the same time, they changed many times from time to time. Yeah, UN was established by 51 powers. Now the number of UN members is 193, a little bit bigger than initially. This is why I suppose red lines will be and could be changed. However, Russia is interested in its economic presence, yeah, and its role as mediator in relationship between Armenia and Azerbaijan and final a peace treaty. Russia is not accepting the deal outside of our role, our presence, like outside model from United States, from European Union plus United States. Russia is taking care and concerning about growing European Union role because Ursula von der Leyen is not honest, thinking about humanitarian aid or some cultural dimension, visa-free regime. European Union launching mission along the Azerbaijani-Armenian border claims to be part of security system of Armenia. But it's a challenge to the Russian exclusive position. All those things are considered to be challenges. And Russia is not interested to cooperate economically with Armenia, observing when Armenia is replacing the security context, military context, and so on and so on. I suppose maybe in a short-term perspective, Russia will address Armenia with some constructive offers, as we say, constructive offers to be discussed. Let's see on their results. I hope we will have opportunity, if you want, if you are not disappointed in communication with.
No, no, no.
We would love to.
We want that.
You always
We will
have a
continue.
blank invitation to come to our podcast, Dr. Markedonov. Uh, on this interesting note, do you have anything else to add in terms of the Armenian-Russian relations in the next, let's say, 3 to 4 months? What can be expected, or do you believe this is going to be a longer period of readjustment, trying to find each other out, and coming up with a modus vivendi, a new modus vivendi?
I will have to say more or less definitely that we will have new normality. It's impossible to return to the previous model of strategic alliance like existed prior to Second Karabakh War or especially after 2023, 2024. However, we have interest for both of us to cooperate to reconcile because no special guarantees from the Western side. West uses Armenia like a tool how to diminish the Russian presence in one selected country in South Caucasus in general. This is why we have clear interests. However, many things will be dependent on background factors. Now, the role of background factor is stronger than 2, 3, 5 years ago. I mean here, Ukrainian dynamics, of course, especially indirect impact of these dynamics on the battlefields. Role of United States, conflict in Iran, because United States tried to make revenge for its previous failure. Yeah, maybe they hope to replay this game This is why our bilateral relations, of course, are dependent on our will and wish, but on other background factors. Many things are not quite clear right now. The interest is clear, a request for a reconciliation is clear, but we will see behavior of Armenian elites, because just recently the Serbian leader Alexander Vucic talked with representatives of Kiev, and they raised some not quite pleasant issues for Russian-Serbian agenda, and President Vucic interrupted his fellow, saying, sorry for us, this viewpoint is not acceptable. If Pashinyan will interrupt Zelensky in Yerevan, saying, no discussion here on bombardment of Moscow, I suppose reaction of Russia was different. Not so positive, taking into account Zelensky himself in Yerevan, but it will be seriously different. If Russia observed and catched the Pashinyan's attitude to Zelensky not like admirer, like symbol of Europeanization and so on. And of course, it's necessary to take into account failed Europeanization experiences in Georgia, in Moldova, in Ukraine, and price of the question.
Dr. Markedonov, just like you said, I think that it's going to take a long period of readjustment, and we hope to keep up with you to understand how the adjustments are going between Armenia and Russia. So thank you so much for joining us today. That was an insightful conversation. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Dr. Markedonov.
All right. Well, that was our show today. The episode is being recorded on July 8th, 2026.
And thank you for listening to our show, everyone. Your confidence in us rewards our dedication to bring you intelligent and independent coverage of Armenian news. I want to underscore independent because in this world of media, there are very few really independent voices on Armenia. Most of them you can find are on the payroll of this or that world power. We are two independent people who are self-funding this, and we are relying on your support to help us a little bit in terms of covering our costs and bringing you a truly independent opinions and analysis. There are no corporate or government shills, no political associations, and just the two of us. So please consider supporting us. Go to podcast.groong.org/donate and ideally become a sustaining member. We can use your help.
We're definitely not on our way to becoming oligarchs. That's for sure. We've been talking with Dr. Sergey Markedonov. He is a historian and analyst specializing in Russia's foreign policy, the South Caucasus, and post-Soviet conflict regions. He is a leading research fellow at McGill University Institute for International Studies and editor-in-chief of International Analytics. For more information, you can go to podcast.groong.org/episode number. Follow the links for his bio and other links that we put in there. Thank you very much. We will talk to you soon. I'm Asbet Bedrosyan.
And I'm Hovik Manucharian. Take care.